Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 95, Cap Ranks and the 17-Article Constitution. We're still talking about the reign of Kashikiya Hime, aka Suiko Tenno, from the late 6th to the early 7th century. We've been covering discussions of the continental influences on the archipelago, especially as Yamato adopted more and more continental practices, both religion and government. This episode, we're going to continue the discussion regarding the changes Japan was adopting in their own government as a result of greater adoption of continental philosophy. Now, these are largely seen as a sinification or a trend towards a more Chinese-style system, but I want to emphasize that a lot of this was filtered through the lens of the states on the Korean Peninsula, Baekje, Goguryeo, and Shilla. This is one of the reasons I hesitate to just call it Chinese, as Yamato is really blending aspects of several cultural influences, as well as adding their own spice to the sauce. This will eventually lead to discussion of the interactions between Yamato and the Sui court, and Yamato not just requesting recognition of titles, but of defining their own place in the diplomatic sphere, whether rightly or wrongly. In the last episode, we talked about Yamato's contact with the continent, specifically the Korean Peninsula, and the various diplomatic gifts, often put in terms of tribute, that came over. Besides a small menagerie of exotic animals and Buddhist statues, there were learned monks and various books conveying continental teachings. At the same time that Yamato was starting to experiment with a new foreign religion, Buddhism, they also began to experiment with other foreign concepts. They had members of the court studying specific disciplines and presumably passing those on to others. They also were instituting changes in the way the court governed. One of these changes was the introduction of a new court rank system. Up to this point, we've seen a variety of titles on the archipelago that fall under the general concept of kabane. Most of these were titles granted to an entire family, with some notable exceptions such as tsukune. But now we start to see an innovation for Yamato, a rank system where the rank is held by an individual. Government on the continent had long instituted various rank systems of this type based on the conceit of a meritocracy. That is, that the most learned and capable individuals would be given the highest and most prestigious ranks, and they would rise to the top. In many cases, there were even tests to ascertain a candidate's knowledge of the classic works. Theoretically, then, anyone could become a high minister, helping to guide the state. In reality, however, things usually broke down pretty quickly. For instance, since there wasn't the concept of public education in the same way we have today, you had to have time and money to be able to study. Later, they would institute various laws that provided explicit benefits for the children of high-ranking nobles. But for all of the system's flaws, individuals could now be promoted in rank based on their own abilities demonstrated in those positions. The Yamato court instituted a new 12-rank system in the 12th month of 603. It consisted of 6 categories, each named after a virtue and divided into a dai or sho, that is, the greater or lesser of the ranks. And so we have, in order from highest to lowest, toku, virtue, nin, benevolence, rai, propriety, shin, faith, gi, justice, and chi, knowledge or wisdom. When combined, the ranks are daitoku, shotoku, dainin, shonin, dairai, shorai, and, well, you get the picture. These ranks were applied specifically to members of the court. They didn't appear to include members of the royal family. So the sovereign, crown prince, and various other princes appear to have been exempt from this system. They were apart from it. In addition, shortly after the ranks themselves were introduced, a second decree dictated official court uniforms with special caps and different colors for each. This was the start of a tradition of sumptuary decrees determining what clothing different officials would wear, at least while they were on duty. And if you think about it, instituting the cap system along with the ranks was rather ingenious, as it gave a clear indicator to anybody as to what someone's rank was. After all, humans are pretty good at classification systems, much to our detriment sometimes. But as we mentioned with the Kabane system, Yamato's method up to this point had been to classify by family. If you knew someone was of the Omi or Muraji families, and let's say you were just a Tae, then you probably gave them a fair amount of deference. With this new system, though, even though you might not be used to tracking individual rank when others are wearing special caps or even special clothing, then it becomes that much simpler to know where you all stand in relation to one another. I'm not sure that this was intentionally adopted for this reason or if it was just what others were doing at the time, but I can only imagine that it helped with the adoption of the new rank system. Now, this rank system, or Kan-i Junikai, is similar to those used in the courts of Baekje, Goguryeo, and even the Sui, but it doesn't exactly line up to any of them. It's clear that there were some local considerations given, which is often attributed to the influence of the Crown Prince Sho Tokutaishi, aka Prince Umayado. Of course, whether or not that's actually the case is likely unknowable, especially given all of the other legendary stories surrounding the Crown Prince and the cults that came to worship him as a semi-divine figure in later centuries. By the way, although they may sound the same, the Shotoku of Shotoku Taishi's name is not the same as the Shotoku rank. For one, as I mentioned before, I don't believe that the royal princes participated in the rank system. That was for members of the various uji, while the princes were held apart. No, Umayado's moniker is made up of two characters meaning something like holy virtue, referencing the influence he had on Buddhism, while the Shotoku of the rank system was literally small virtue, the second rank of the system. There is so much wrapped up in the creation of this rank system. For one, we start to get our first direct evidence of the archipelago adopting continental-style clothing. We have some evidence of the clothing for the later Kofun period from things like the clay haniwa adorning many of the various Kofun. Some of these are quite detailed, to the point of showing seams, ties, and other important features, although sometimes it's difficult to tell what was accurate and what had to be done as conceits to the medium, clay, as delicate features might be lost or easily break down. Many of these haniwa show what appear to be distinctive styles of clothing. However, this new system of colored caps, along with a few other references this reign to official clothing in general, would seem to indicate the introduction of continental-style clothing, at least for official functions. This would be a trend that would continue for several centuries, with the court fashion of the Sui and Tang courts becoming the basis for much of the later court sokutai, or formal garments. Although this may not have been immediately obvious given all the changes that were made over the years, particularly in the later Heian period when garments drifted quite far from their continental inspirations. Of course, clothing wasn't the only impact of this change. Up to this point, since rank in Yamato had been based on your family, your uji, the court had started creating the various Bei and Uji families as an outgrowth of the court's control. That meant that to have any standing in the court as a worthy of Yamato, you had to be a part of one of these families. And bringing in foreigners with special skills such as weaving or calendrical studies or Buddhism meant bringing in whole familial groups of artisans or so on, such as the weaving skills of the Hata or the Aya clans. Over time, those familial groups had attained their own special status, and one could marry into a particular family group, but by the 6th century, it would appear that the system had begun to solidify. Now, however, under this new system, court rank could be given out to anyone, or anything really. There are actually stories of a cat being given the 5th rank in a later period. This made it even easier for foreigners to be brought into the Yamato court system, as court ranks could be given directly to people, even from other countries. Skilled professionals, scribes, doctors, and others could be invited into Yamato and granted a high rank in the court, even if they didn't come from an established family group. Though whether or not the system was created for that purpose, I don't know if I could really say. Still, intended or not, it would have had a significant impact on the court's ability to recruit talent from abroad in a positive way. Shortly after this, there was another innovation, this one more directly attributed to the Crown Prince, aka Shotoku Taishi. It's known to us today as the 17-Article Constitution, and it's been historically described as the founding legal framework of Japan. It was the first written law code, and it had 17 laws, although really they come across more as moral maxims that should be followed rather than strict laws that must be obeyed. There's also not a little bit of doubt and question surrounding its authenticity. Was this really something that was drafted in the early 600s, especially since it's explicitly stated to be the work of the Crown Prince, Shotoku Taishi himself? Or was this something that the cult of Shotoku put together later to help expound on Shotoku Taishi's nation-building bona fides? Certainly, much of the sentiment embodied in the extant text would apply to the thinking of the following centuries. Regardless of its authenticity, this is often seen as Japan's very first constitution, defining it as a legal entity. It clearly draws from both Buddhist and Confucian concepts, and many of the admonitions would likely fit with modern Japanese society as well as ancient. Then again, many of the articles contain what we might just consider common sense for the running of a harmonious society, though how exactly it would be enforced and the priority given to any particular article would certainly make a difference. We'll go over the 17 articles and touch on each briefly. I'm sure there's a lot more that could be said about all these, and I'll give you my impressions, but I'm not going to do a full scholarly dissection of each one. Rather, I'll give you some things I think you may want to think about, but if you take a look at this on your own, you may find other aspects to consider as well. There is a part of me that wonders if reading an ancient legal document is the best thing for a podcast, but I found it interesting, and I hope you will as well. Certainly, it gives us some insight into at least the values that they were modeling their court and society after. Now, first, let's just go through the highlights of the 17 articles, and then we'll dive into each one. The 17 articles are roughly 1. Harmony is to be valued. 2. Reverence the three treasures. 3. Obey the sovereign's commands. 4. Ministers should act with decorum. 5. Ministers should deal impartially with suits submitted to them. 6. Chastise what is evil and encourage that which is good. 7. Let everyone have their own charge, and let not the spheres of duty be confused. 8. Let the ministers and functionaries arrive early and retire late. 9. Good faith is the foundation of right. 10. Let us cease from wrath and refrain from angry looks. 11. Keep track of merit or demerit and reward or punish appropriately. 12. Don't let the local lords levy taxes. That is for the central government alone. 13. Everyone employed in an official office should attend diligently to their functions. 14. Be not envious. 15. The path of the minister is to turn away from that which is private and focus on the public. 16. Only conscript people into forced labor at the right times. Finally, 17. Discuss weighty matters with a group. Don't make big decisions just by one person. As you can see, even at a glance, there's a lot of Confucian-style government wrapped up in this, although there's not a small amount of Buddhist philosophy as well. Each one of these articles is further expounded upon with some examples and a little bit more information about what each one is for. Most of this, like the rank system, applies primarily to the members of the Yamato court administration and how those who are members of the government should function. Many of them are non-specific moral tenets to help guide ministers in how to behave. There are a few considerations, though, that seem to be specific to the situation that Yamato found itself in regarding the administration of the land in general, such as taxes and periods of conscription. For those used to modern constitutions, this is perhaps a bit vague. It isn't setting up specific laws, likely because the court still operated by tradition and not a small amount of fiat from those in charge. More specific guidance will come in the later law codes, but even those harken back to this as the foundation. We'll touch on that as we look more closely at each article. Some of these we'll probably delve into a little more, while others are pretty self-explanatory. Aston's translation is out there in various forms, and I'd suggest taking a look at it, and take a look at the Japanese text if you get a chance. First, and I'm paraphrasing from Aston's translation, harmony is to be valued and people should avoid quarrels. Here the articles talk about the need for people to be peaceful and to work within the system. So basically they were telling everyone, go along to get along. It also includes the ideas, don't make trouble for your neighbors and obey the rules of filial piety. On the one hand, this is all about telling people to be good citizens, but it's also something that even today is highly valued in Japanese society. I mean, there's a famous saying, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. A brief note on filial piety, by the way. While the idea that children should obey their parents probably goes back to early humans, and no doubt the first parent telling their child, this is how you'll behave as long as you live in my cave, or something like that, Confucius and his disciples really took this to the next level. Not only did it apply from a son to a parent, it was also the relationship between elder and younger siblings, between a husband and wife, between friends, and between the individual and the state. While there's certainly a lot in there regarding working of the state, it also brings in a lot of baggage, including a definite bias towards patriarchy, which is particularly interesting given that it was coming during the reign of Kashikiya Hime. One consequence is that this enforces social class as a real, natural, and even necessary state of the world. There are those above and those below must obey those above, or else there will be disharmony in the universe. Sure, it's good to tell people not to fight and to try to get along, but the emphasis is definitely there on obeying your superiors. And of course, the people putting this together are those superiors, so one might suggest that they were not entirely objective in this. The distinction between social classes in society would ebb and flow over time. I would not, for example, confuse the Confucian influence of this period with, say, the strict Neo-Confucian laws of the Edo period. On the other hand, we can't say that this is strictly a Confucian thing either, as the Uji-Kabane system is effectively a class, and one might even say a caste system, with your social rank almost entirely dependent on your family status, therefore, where you were born. The second article states that one should reverence the three treasures. This sets up the official state sponsorship of Buddhism as the national religion. So we start by telling people to be harmonious and don't cause trouble, and then we tell them to worship Buddhism. This is really big when you consider that for most of the past century, many of the elites have been actively campaigning against the foreign influence of Buddhism in the country, and now here they are enshrining it in their constitutional documents. Furthermore, where are the kami in all this? Certainly a large part of the sovereign's duties were traditionally based on their interactions with and success in pleasing the various spirits of heaven and earth. Where exactly do they fall in all this? The third article states that people should obey the sovereign's commands, which is pretty straightforward, and I'm not really sure it needs much explanation. My only comment at this point would be that it's interesting that this comes third in the list. In the fourth article, we're told that the ministers should act with decorum. It comes down to the idea that ministers and officials are required to properly follow the rituals so that those below them will do the same, and thus the world will be in order. This again conforms to a general idea in Confucian thought that if everyone from highest to lowest just did as they were supposed to, then the world, including the natural world, would be in order. This is often simplified down to the way of heaven, or even just the way. So yes, this is the way. There's also a hint that disorder below stems from disorder above. If the officials don't act in accordance with the laws and morals being handed down, then why should anyone expect those below them to take these articles seriously either? In the fifth article, we get the idea that ministers should deal impartially with suits submitted to them. Basically, an anti corruption law. You know, don't take bribes, deal with everyone fairly. One might say that this and the fourth are somewhat redundant, but the fact that you even have to mention this one probably says something about society and expectations. It should be noted that people rarely write laws and rules about things that everyone just does. So, yeah, I'm sure that by writing this law into the Constitution, then that ended corruption for everyone, everywhere, for all time. The sixth article seems like common sense. Chastise what is evil and encourage that which is good. This also exhorts people that they shouldn't just flatter people to get ahead. They should provide good counsel and speak truth to power. Of course, that's an absolutely wonderful statement, but there are plenty of caveats, especially in a rank-conscious society where those of higher rank are assumed to be naturally better, smarter, and more capable for some reason. In fact, more commonly, it would be the case that true debate would only occur between those of relatively equal social status. Once a superior entered the conversation, I would often shut down debate on a topic from everyone below them. Later sovereigns would look for ways to encourage this particular maxim, often finding extra social safe spaces where rank could be temporarily discarded. Even then, however, those spaces were only as safe as those in power made them, something that can afflict any hierarchical relationship. The seventh article was to let everyone have their own charge, and let not the spheres of duty be confused. I find this one a bit more tricky, but it does follow with the theme. If you just have every person do the thing they are best suited for, then things will run well. Furthermore, you shouldn't just create a position for someone. There should be an actual need that they can fill. Like many of these articles, this is easy to say, yeah, that sounds great, but the devil is in the details. Just how do you determine who is good, let alone the best at any given task, and make sure that they are the ones doing it? How do you train people up to take on those roles? What if nobody is really good at the thing that needs to be done? There's also the other side of this. What if someone else does something they shouldn't? If you take this in a legalist sense, then you end up punishing people for doing the quote-unquote wrong thing. Legalists are the rules lawyers of ancient philosophy, whereas Confucianism generally believed that people will just do these things naturally if they're given the right path. Legalism assumes that people are naturally evil and selfish, and therefore you must enforce the way of heaven through strict legal measures and punishments. Thus, it's easy for something like a moral maxim to eventually become something that can be turned around and bring about punishment for not adhering to it. As we get down to the eighth article, we're getting more and more in the weeds. For instance, let the ministers and functionaries arrive early and retire late. This is basically just setting up office hours for court officials. It isn't entirely clear how the ancient Yamato court worked, but the systems that were being imparted in the 7th century were clearly bureaucratic. In many of the courts where these ideas had been refined, there was an idea that court officials would be expected to show up early, often before sunrise, and they wouldn't leave until after the sun had set. Much of their life would be spent in the court working. Often, officers would be expected to queue in front of the gates early in the morning. Not sure that they necessarily had a concept of work-life balance, not like we talk about today. That said, in the days before electric lights, it was not uncommon to get up before the first light and then go to bed after the sun was down so that you could maximize the daylight hours. Our modern sleep cycle, where we can often stay up well past midnight working on our side projects, say writing up a script for a podcast, would have been much harder when the only light at night was flickering light of a candle. Not that there weren't people who did that, but things were certainly different. So in ancient China, it was not uncommon for people to show up at the gates around 4 a.m. to be let in. On top of that, if you missed the opening of the gates, you'd be late, and in some cases, you might not even be let in. You'd just be absent for the day, I guess. The Yamato court probably wasn't quite as strict as those on the continent, I suspect, and of course, rules could apply differently depending on where you stood in the pecking order. I doubt the high ministers were held to quite the same standard. Again, the 9th article seems like common sense when you look at it. Good faith is the foundation of right. Basically, this is the idea that people need to be able to trust each other to make things work. You can have all the laws and rules you want, but if people don't treat each other in good faith within the rules of your agreed social system, then much of the rest of it breaks down. Of course, operating in good faith in a hierarchical class system is not necessarily indicative of equality. Two individuals may operate differently, both in good faith, as long as they conform to the social contract. Thus, it continues to enforce the concepts of inequality of lord and vassal. Article 10 is one that I rather like just for its wording. Let us cease from wrath and refrain from angry looks. In fact, let me quote the entire Aston translation on this one. You'll get a sense of just how long these were. They weren't extremely long, but they were more than just like a single line. Let us cease from wrath and refrain from angry looks, nor let us be resentful when others differ from us. For all men have hearts, and each heart has its own leanings. Their right is our wrong, and our right is their wrong. We are not unquestionably sages, nor are they unquestionably fools. Both of us are simply ordinary men. How can anyone lay down a rule by which to distinguish right from wrong? For we are all one with another, wise and foolish, like a ring which has no end. Therefore, although others give way to anger, let us on the contrary dread our own faults, and though we alone may be in the right, let us follow the multitude and act like them. Once again, there are some things here that we can all appreciate. For example, don't be angry with people just because they're different. It even goes so far as to note that sometimes your right is their wrong and vice versa. It also exhorts us to remember that nobody is infallible and everyone can be foolish at times. Honestly, it almost reads like some kind of ancient diversity and inclusion initiative, or like something out of the Christian Bible about how we should respect other people. It very specifically says that we should not be resentful of people who are different from us. Of course, this is stuck in with a lot of other messages about how one should submit to a hierarchical system, and we are well over halfway through things before we get here, so take that as you will. Moving on to Article 11, we're told to keep track of merit or demerit and reward or punish appropriately. High functionaries should reward people for good things and punish them for crimes. Again, this seems straightforward, but it also engages in a bit of contemporary social commentary, claiming that in those days, reward does not attend upon merit, nor punishment upon crime. Immediately, I start to think about Soga no Umako and his rise to power. For all that there was a need for consensus, there was still a general attitude that might made right, as evidenced with all the various succession struggles. Once again, one has to wonder how well this particular admonishment was actually adhered to, though it certainly fits with the general sense of the other notions. Article 12 seems rather specific. Don't let the local lords, that is to say the kimi, and the kun no miyatsuko, levy taxes. That is for the central government alone. This is something that I'm not sure we've really discussed and really wasn't talked about, but it would seem that up to this point, people would be expected to pay taxes not only to the court, but also to the local elites. In fact, for much of Yamato's history, while it may have had status as the paramount state, local individuals would have been more directly affected by their local lords, who exercised a greater deal of control. Over time, we see the establishment of the various familial units as extensions of the court. The miyake, or royal granaries, go out, which would require some amount of court administration and centralization. Now, however, we see an actual edict to bring the ultimate authority of taxation to the crown itself. Whether or not this was immediately effective, one might argue either way, but the establishment of the legal principle and the foundation of the nation is pretty clear, so at least notionally, there was now an expectation that Yamato would have this kind of power and control. Other legal codes would build on this as the assumption, even if not the true reality. That said, we can see from later tax collection that this may have become a distinction almost without difference. One of the things that would make provincial estates so lucrative for many families, despite being away from the center of politics, was that in raising taxes on the people, they were often given broad discretionary powers to set the tax rate on the individuals at whatever they could afford, as long as they then passed along to the court whatever was expected. The difference between the two would then go towards the administrative costs of managing the land. And this was not an uncommon practice throughout history. We'll see it come up again and again. In Japan's Warring State periods, similar practices would be employed, empowering local daimyo to raise taxes as they saw fit, and it was a balance between what they could raise and how well they could keep the peace. Of course, if the taxes went too high and were too severe, that could lead to unrest, which might then instill a lack of confidence in the administrator's capabilities, creating incentives for the administrators to be cautious of overreaching for their own profit. Still, few people have jumped with joy at any mention of taxes, and typically any amount is seen as too high. Article 13 again talks about court officials. Specifically, it states that everyone employed in an official office should attend diligently to their functions. Basically, if you have a job, you need to do it. They do add some leave provisions, so court officers might need to take sick leave, or they might be tasked with special missions that take them physically away on a kind of temporary duty. Otherwise, though, if you're healthy and not on some kind of business trip, then you should be in the office. Of course, they didn't exactly have the concept of work from home, unless, I guess, if you actually lived in the palace itself. 14th article is, again, a straightforward admonition to the officers. Be not envious. In this case, don't be envious of others, particularly other ministers. This was probably particularly necessary since the setup of the cap and rank system. After all, they went from a system based on family rank, which still existed, by the way, so there's that, to one nominally based on individual rank. No doubt there were people who would have their nose out of joint when someone from a lesser family, or even no family at all, was promoted over them. Nominally, this was because they were more talented, although given some universal understandings of the human experience, I imagine that the conversations around a jug of sake were not too dissimilar to water cooler talk about promotions today. Almost at the end, Article 15 continues to define what it means to be a good minister. The path of the minister is to turn away from that which is private and focus on the public. Basically, the ministers are supposed to be working for the greater good, or at least the greater good of the Yamato state. No doubt this is very specifically calling out the kind of interfamilial politics that had led to things like the Soga and Mononobe conflicts, but it also calls out personal ambition and greed as well. It's an attempt to ask all of the ministers to act with professionalism in the workplace. Once again, how well that actually worked out? Well, politics is politics, and the politics of the court were almost always personal. Wonderful sentiment, but perhaps more commonly observed in the breach, as it were. The penultimate article, Article 16, is one of the few that are focused on more practical concerns. Specifically, it states that one should only conscript people into forced labor at the right times. There's a whole part about conscripting people into forced labor at all, but that is how things worked at this period. Yamato was still very much an agricultural society, with the basis of its economy being the harvest. If you pulled people away from their work in the wrong seasons, disaster could follow. Sure, it might be great to build that massive tomb or great temple, but if the fields aren't planted or harvested at the right time, you're going to set yourself up for famine and failure. This was likely already understood by any competent project manager of the day, but that didn't mean it wasn't good advice to include in the laws. Remember, common sense is rarely common. In fact, it very specifically says that people should only be conscripted in the wintertime. Not necessarily the best of times to be building things or digging in the dirt, given cold and other factors, but it sure beats famine. Finally, last but not least, Article 17. Discuss weighty matters with a group. Don't make big decisions just by one person. Again, this may seem obvious to us. You have all these people with different ideas and expertise, so why not use them? On the other hand, they had just instituted a brand new ranking system in a society that was already very class conscious, so probably not a bad thing to remind them that 2 heads, or more, are usually better than 1. So these, we're told, were the means of governing the state of Yamato. It had set itself up with court rank system, including sumptuary laws for the court officials, and it had laid out the principles on which the government was to operate. Even today, there are legal arguments that since this was never abolished, any part of this legal code that is not technically contradicted by later law would still be considered valid. Not that there's necessarily any legal punishment associated with it. There's quite a valid argument that a lot of this may have been a later invention. The terminology and wording is very sinified, and some have suggested that these were put in place much later. Perhaps there had been a written code, but given the later codes that superseded it, it may have been questionable as to whether there was actually an extant written copy of the original. Or perhaps the chroniclers massaged the text to be more relevant to an 8th century audience. Who knows for certain? Still, it is an important milestone. Certainly, regardless of whether they had the full 17-article constitution or not, the court was taking on more of a sinified appearance, especially in its diplomatic relations with others. Next episode, we'll talk about that some more as we take a look at Yamato's famous embassy to the Middle Kingdom itself, where even the Sui history recalls the sovereign of Yamato taking on a new title, that of the Child of Heaven, aka the Emperor of the East. But we'll get to that next time. Until then, thank you for listening and for all of your support. If you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our Ko-fi site. That's ko-fi.com/sengokudaimyo, or find the links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we'll have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, feel free to tweet at us at Sengoku Podcast or reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. That's all for now. Thank you again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.